So, yes, what we have seen is an example of gender stereotypes. So I would like to open the floor and to ask, what are gender stereotypes? If you would like to have a go at explaining what this means, please feel free to put it in the chat. I am trying to see the chat at the same time. The ingrained stereotype that surgeons are male. Yes, this is a stereotype. So I'll just keep going. So exactly that gender stereotypes are simply generalizations about what makes a man or woman, such as thinking that men are naturally better leaders, or there's an expectation that all girls and women are nurturing and caring by nature. So these are all generalizations about what makes us who we are, and it's the stereotype. So most of the time, stereotypes are easy to spot because there are generalizations about large group of people, and we actually know that they cannot be true 100% of the time. The insidious thing about stereotypes is that these stereotypes get ingrained in how we think and then affect our decision making, both consciously and unconsciously. So this is where a stereotype becomes a gender bias, a personal preference, a like or dislike towards a specific individual just because of their gender. So we can also look into how gender stereotypes have affected us. You can put it in the chat. For example, what were you thought about girls and boys as a child that turned out not to be true? And how do you think, for example, this assumption affected you? It can be that boys do not cry. It can be that girls are naturally more emotional or more sensitive. Please put it in the chat and I will try to check them as we keep moving. So gender stereotypes are closely linked to gender roles because gender roles are the roles a person is expected to perform in specific culture based on their gender. So indeed, if we expect men and women to have certain characteristics, attitudes, and skills based on their gender, we might tend to expect them to take up certain roles. So for instance, if we expect women to be more nurturing and men to be more assertive and ambitious, we will assume that women are more suited to look after children, and whereas men are more suited to work and provide for the family. Another thing we saw in the video was gender bias. So we all like the thing that we treat people equally, no matter what their sex, gender, skin color, nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, ability, all these things. But in reality, these stereotypes convert into biases that consciously and unconsciously influence our decisions. For example, it can be that growing up with the stereotype that men are natural leaders and women's role is to take care of her home and family can, if unchecked, lead to discriminatory gender bias. For instance, it could consciously or subconsciously influence my decision to select a man over an equally qualified pregnant woman for a position or for a grant. So gender bias is a personal preference, which can be either positive or negative as well, towards a specific person because of their gender. So bias can be conscious. It can be consciously making a judgment about someone or a decision based on their gender. So I choose a man over a woman for a leadership role because I think she might get pregnant and it's not smart for me to hire the woman. It can be unconscious because I can make a judgment about someone or a decision based on their gender without being aware of it. This can be, I choose a man for a leadership role over an equally qualified woman because I internalize the idea that men tend to be natural leaders more than women. So unconscious biases are tricky because they get ingrained in how we think and how we view the world, and they create shortcuts in our brains that affect our decision making without us even realizing it. So these gender stereotypes contribute to existing gender inequalities as one of the root causes that affects all areas of society. Now, before moving on to mitigation strategies, which I will present, I would like to look at the cycle of gender inequality to show how important it is actually to catch gender stereotypes and biases as how these contribute to existing gender inequalities. So gender inequality can be looked at in different ways. And today I will use the way of looking at gender inequality as part of a wheel of inequality, which is what you see on the screen. So this shows how discrimination is the product of complex processes, systems, and structures of inequality, and that all these different dynamics reinforce themselves in a cyclical manner, so they follow each other. And to understand it better, we are using an example, a problem statement. That is that around the world, only 6 parliaments have equal or greater representation of women. As this is a cycle, we could actually start from any point, but since we are already familiar with stereotypes and biases, let's start from there. I will put all the... Yes, perfect. So gender stereotypes and biases. We saw how stereotypes can lead to unequal gender roles, and this is, of course, includes different roles in performing different types of work. For instance, the stereotype that men are natural leaders and women are nurturing by nature might lead to women staying at home and performing unpaid domestic work, such as housekeeping, taking care of children or elderly, whereas men, in our example, will run for the office and will be in the parliament. So from gender stereotypes, we arrive to the gender division of labor. So we are on this part. So we are on this part. So we are arriving to gender division of labor, where women and men have traditionally been assigned different economic, social, or political roles. When we add systems of racism, of ability, of heteronormativity, which are intersectional factors, of class and others, the division of labor and its impacts becomes even more starker. For instance, most presidents or prime ministers around the world are able-bodied from ethnic majority and men, and women are often expected to engage in unpaid low-income labor, such as looking after the children. So this division of labor meditates to our point 3, who has access to and control over resources. If women stay at home and men pursue a career in politics in our case, then men will enter political networks and work on this sphere, thus gaining popularity and earning money, while women will be dependent on men for financial support and for influence. And in the end, this leads to inequality in power, privilege, and access to rights. So because men have been pursuing careers in political sphere, they will be elected to political office and positions of power. Women instead are underrepresented at the decision-making tables, where important decisions about their rights and their lives are made. This is clearly shown, for instance, by the fact that only recently most countries adopted equal rights for men and women in the law, and in many countries there still are different laws on issues such as inheritance. But the underrepresentation of women in parliament doesn't only affect access to rights and power, but also our next point, the systems of social organizations which will reinforce existing gender inequality. So indeed, if we only have men at the decision-making tables and in the political sphere, as they do not experience what it means to be a woman and what are women's specific needs, they will design political systems that do not meet the specific needs of women, who, for instance, are usually the ones with caregiving responsibilities. So a lack of nurseries, breastfeeding spaces in parliaments will hinder them from entering these spaces. If we think of our mandated areas with the UNODC, for example, this also will create an issue in law enforcement where women need specific spaces for changing that doesn't exist. So the fact that these spaces do not accommodate the needs of women reinforces the gender stereotype and bias that men are natural leaders and women are natural caregivers, because we see a space where women's needs are not met, and therefore we tend to think that women are not suitable for the political sphere, instead of questioning how the systems is constructed and whether instead it is like this because it was built by men for men. So it's a cycle that follows each other. And this is also worsened by the representation and the media. If we only see men in politics, we might assume that it's a profession for men and men are better suited for. So to provide an example of this, we can think of how, for example, cartoons for children are now starting to portray much more diversity, including people of different races, And online, you can see how children react to seeing someone who looks just like them, portrayed as a princess or a hero. So now, since this is such an important topic and it is something that exacerbates existing inequalities in our society, we can also talk about how to mitigate them, how to be aware of them. Sometimes we catch ourselves thinking or acting on gender bias, but other times they can pass by undetected if we don't actively check for them or try to prevent them. We all have them. I think it's important to accept that at first. It's a fact of being human, but what we can do is try to catch them and try to mitigate them the best way that we can. So the good news is that there are simple mitigation techniques we can use to avoid letting these biases lead us to speak and act in ways that discriminate. So in other words, to lead by example. We will use some techniques that will help us to lead by example. So I compiled these mitigation techniques into two categories. We will look at the first one first. This is the category 1. And I call this identify it and take action. So the first one would be stereotype and bias check. Before making any decision, identify the relevant potential stereotypes and biases and reflect on whether or not they can be influencing your decision. There's also this counter-stereotyping technique. Why am I thinking this? Could the opposite be true? Would I think the same if this person was a man or if it was a woman, and vice versa? So trying to understand really, is there a reason why am I thinking like this? Individuation technique. Am I making a generalization about a whole group of people when I'm talking to this one person? So when I talk to this woman, am I making this generalization that women should stay at home in general? And perspective talking. What if I was this person and what might the situation look like from their perspective? Then we also have the second category. This is about proactively designed to reduce biases. So this involves slowing things down a little so as to prevent bias from sneaking in, if that makes sense. So it is about building in extra time for decision-making processes to avoid snap judgments, fast judgments that rely on unconscious bias. Consult others if needed. Other one would be use structured processes for decision-making. This can be requiring written justifications for decisions, including criteria, for example, hiring someone, what was chosen and why and by whom. For example, in recruitment decision-making, you have a scoring template. We have a scoring template that we don't look at the pictures or the names, and we are trying to make a decision based on that. And the other one is drafting a clear criteria and objective standards for management processes, such as hiring and performance evaluation. So as our gender and other bias get triggered all the time, relying on ourselves to identify them and try to avoid their influence is useful. But what has proven to have even more positive impact in the workplace is to redesign processes so that we avoid triggering biases. It can be as simple as removing the name, age, and sex from a job application. And then you are avoiding bias from sneaking in. Before ending, I will give one last example. There's a school in Paris, and during COVID-19, this school had to cancel oral entrance exams for its literature program. Instead, the entrance was based entirely on a blind written test. They didn't reveal the candidates' identities. And the result is that twice as many women were selected. And I will put the link to chat because I think, let me put it in the chat. Perfect. Because it's just a simple change to design and it has a dramatic impact. So thank you. And I can check the chat and answer any questions.